I was the steward of Havshaw for 33 years, and I had turned away 31 companions before her. Not one had made it past the drawing-room threshold. The Duke of Havshaw, my Duke, Gideon Winter, whom the county had learnt to call the Scarred Duke, would not have a woman in his house. He said so plainly the first year, and after that he did not need to say it. He set his shoulder to the fire and read. He took his supper alone. When a lady's carriage came up the drive, he went out at the north door and did not come back until we had seen her off. The refusals I wrote were a small torture I had learnt to bear, and I bore them because it was my place. The scar was 3 winters old that February. He had come out of the East Farm blaze with the Kentish boy alive in his arms and the whole left side of his face and his good hand ruined. The boy had lived, the ruin had lasted. Before that he had been a young duke, quiet by nature, made suddenly quieter by the death of his brother Edmund the summer before, and altered again by the fire and by a mother who could no longer look at him without weeping. When she died at Michaelmas he shut the house. The library became his rooms. The West Library, where Edmund had kept his desk, and where a small brass-cornered calfskin box had sat locked on the sideboard by the window since 1811. I had known the box 11 years. I had unpacked the sea chest myself when the Cape Survey's ship put in with the effects of the young men who had not come home. Master Edmund's things were sewn into a canvas the mate had stitched with his own thread. The calfskin box was inside that, wrapped in his best linen shirt. My old Duke, the father, asked me to keep it safe until Gideon was of an age. Gideon was of an age long before I gave it to him. He set it on the sideboard the day he took possession of the library, and he had not opened it since. What was in a dead brother's box, he said once, was not for a living brother's hand. The 32nd reference letter came in the last week of January, laid before me on the study desk by the second footman with a mud-marked corner. The hand was a country hand, small, upright, unhurried. Mrs. Iona Marchmont, 35, of Fenley in Wiltshire, widow of the late Reverend Marchmont, 7 years without him, quiet in her habits, capable of reading aloud 6 evenings a week and of taking a lady's writing for 2 hours a morning. The reference was signed by the sister of my old Duke's oldest friend and had a plain honesty about it. I set it aside. I would write the refusal the next morning. I did not write it. Something in the hand kept me from it. I wrote instead to say a place was offered on a month's trial. I did not tell the Duke. She came up the drive on the 2nd Tuesday of February in a hired chaise that was not clean and did not pretend to be. She stepped out with her cloak already over her arm, a woman who had never made a footman wait, and she did not look up at the house. She looked at me. She said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Reeve. Thank you for the road being cleared. I know the snow made it a labor." She had my name from the letter. That pleased me more than I let show. She was small. She was not pretty. Her eyes were the calm gray of a river in the shade. The Duke met her in the West Library because he did not know she was there. I had taken her through to see the room she would work in. She was to sit and read 3 evenings a week and take his post in the mornings, and he was standing at the west window with his scarred side turned to the panes. He heard the door. He did not turn. He said, "Reeve, I did not send for anyone." Mrs. Marchmont said, in the same quiet voice she had used at the door, "No, sir. Mr. Reeve wrote to me on trial. If you wish me to go, I shall go. I have not unpinned my hat." He turned. He did it slowly and full, the scar into the room without any softening of the light or the angle. Most had flinched. She had not. I would know her the rest of my life by that she did not. She said, "Should you like me to read this evening, or shall I begin tomorrow?" He was silent for the length of 2 long breaths. Then he said, "This evening." She read Cowper first, and then a page of Fielding. She asked which, and he said the second, and she read as a woman reads to herself, not for effect, letting the sentences fall as the writer had set them. She sat on the small chair by the fire and did not glance at him. When the clock struck 10, she closed the book, said good evening, and went up. He watched her go. He did not send for me afterwards. In the morning he asked at the door of the study whether Mrs. Marchmont had slept and whether the room was warm enough. I said yes to both. In the corridor after the first reading, Mrs. Hollies, the housekeeper, touched my sleeve. "Reeve," she said very low, "did you see that he did not turn his scar away when she came in the room?" I had. I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you know what it means?" I said, "I think I do." She said, "Then we shall not send her home in the morning." I did not send her home in the morning. I did not send her home for any morning of that year, nor of any year after. She stayed. The trial month became 2. The housekeeper found her small ways to make her welcome, a hot brick wrapped in flannel in her bed at night, an extra candle in her writing room, the good tea rather than the second, and Mrs. Marchmont thanked her by name each time and never remarked on any of it to me. The kitchen liked her by the second week. The stable liked her by the third, when she stopped to speak to the head groom about his gouty knee and remembered the poultice her father had used for the same, and sent up the receipt in the morning. She wrote his post in the mornings, his tenants' letters, his agents in the same quiet, upright hand she had written her own with, and she read 3 evenings a week. On the 4th she darned. On the 5th she walked the wood path to the parish and back and brought a small parcel to the housekeeper for one of the cottagers. She did not ask about the scar. She did not ask about the Duke's mother or the empty north drawing-room or the box on the sideboard. She spoke when she spoke of Fielding and of the weather, and of a Cowper page she had liked better than the one before. She noticed everything and remarked on almost nothing. I began to hope. In the 3rd week she noticed the calfskin box. I saw her see it. She was setting a small tray for him. He took a pot of tea in the library after supper, and she paused with the tray in her hands and looked at the sideboard for the length of one blink and then set the tray down. She did not touch the box. She did not turn to him and ask. She said good evening at 10 and went up. The next morning she came down early. I was crossing the hall with the post. She stopped me. She said, "Mr. Reeve, on the sideboard in the West Library there is a small calfskin box, brass-cornered. Do you know when it came to the house?" I told her. I said it had come with Master Edmund's effects in 1811. Her hand went, without thinking, to the throat of her dress. She did not weep. She said, "Thank you," and went into the writing. She said nothing to him that day. In the evening she read Fielding at his asking, and she read as clearly as she had read on the first night, and I do not think he knew anything was different. But when I brought the tea and she was standing at the sideboard looking at the box and he was watching her, she did not touch it. She said, "May I ask, sir, the seal on this box? It is a swallow with a broken wing. Do you know where it was made?" He said, "It was my brother's, his personal correspondence. I have not opened it." She said, "The seal is my father's, the Reverend Aldi's of Fenley, God rest him. He had it cut for me from a wax that failed on a birthday letter and the die was thrown after. There is only one." Her voice did not shake, her hands did. He stood up. He said, "Mrs. Marchmont, sit down." She sat down. He came round the fire and sat opposite her, and he did not turn the scar away from her, which he had done in all things until then. He said, "Tell me." She told him. She had known his brother Edmund 4 springs. His aunt at Fenley Court had brought Edmund down for the shooting when she was 20 and he was 22, and they had walked together in the long wood every morning of the fortnight. He had come again the next Michaelmas and asked her father for her. Her father had said yes, and asked only that Edmund tell his own father first. Edmund had gone home to tell his father and had not written for 6 weeks. Then a letter had come saying his mother was too ill for it to be spoken of that year. And then he had sailed. She had written to him 52 letters, one on the first of each week and one on the last, for the 7 months of the voyage, and had had no reply. Then word had come of the fever and of him. She had married the Reverend Marchmont 3 years later, without love but without complaint, and had been quietly a widow now for 7. The Duke was very still. He said, 52 letters. She said, yes. He said, the box on the sideboard has never been opened. She said, I know. He rose, he crossed to the sideboard. He took the small brass key from his watch chain. I had not known until that moment that he had kept it there for 11 years, and he unlocked the calfskin box. He lifted the lid. He said without turning, Mrs. Marchmont, if you would. She went to him, she lifted the topmost folded sheet, she opened it. It was her own hand, 27 years younger, and she began to read it aloud. Her voice held for the first 3 sentences, and then it did not. She read the rest through the quiet weeping of a woman who has been kept from her own grief too long. When she had finished, she folded the sheet and set it back and turned away, and the Duke, my Duke, did the one thing I had not seen him do in 3 winters. He put his scarred hand out, and he laid it on the sleeve of her plain dress, and he did not take it away. We opened nothing further that night. He said only, not all at once, if you will read one to me each evening I should be glad. She said yes. She read them through Lent. 39 letters in 39 evenings. She had written more, but a dozen had gone by the second ship and no doubt were lost. She read them in the order in which she had written them, and he listened with his good hand over his mouth, and his scarred hand open on the arm of his chair. She read the small news of a country parsonage in Wiltshire, the lambs, the almanac her father was compiling, a windfall of pears the vicarage boys had eaten in a single night, and she read the letters that were only love, and she read the last one, written the morning before she had learnt of the fever, in which she had told Edmund that she would come to the Cape herself if he would only send her a passage. She read that one last, and she did not weep for it. She had already wept for it, 7 years and 1 lifetime ago. There was one letter, the 21st, I remember, because I had brought in coal that evening and stayed behind the door, which she read in a slower voice than the rest. In it she had told Edmund about a Sunday when she had walked out alone in the churchyard and found her father's stone worn where the moss had been scraped by boys sitting on it, and had grieved for her father's stone as if he had died again, and then had told Edmund she was writing because she had realized that whatever came, she would not grieve for him a second time. The first grief, whenever it came, would be all she could bear, and so she was writing to fix him in her mind while she still had him whole. The Duke, when she had finished that one, put both his hands over his face, the scarred and the good, and did not speak. She did not go to him. She sat where she was and let him have it. In the morning he was up before I was and had walked out to the East Farm and back before breakfast, and he ate that day for the first time as a man eats who intends to live. Mrs. Marchmont kept her own habits throughout that Lent. She rose at 6, said her own prayers in her room, walked to the parish church on Sunday mornings with the housekeeper for company and back through the wood path in time to write his post before the tray was brought up, and never once mentioned the letters outside the library. She wrote a short note each week to the vicar at Fenley who had followed her husband there, the news of her health, no more, and she sat once a week with Mrs. Hollies in the still-room shelling peas or trimming candles, and would not be drawn on the Duke. Mrs. Hollies told me long afterwards that she had never known a woman to keep so much within her own hand and yet not be cold with it, that Mrs. Marchmont had spoken only once, one evening in April, and had said of the Duke, "He is a good man who has been let think of himself as a monster. I mean to sit beside him until he sees otherwise." Mrs. Hollies had wept, and Mrs. Marchmont had gone on shelling peas, and neither had said anything further. He said on the last night of Lent, when she had closed the 52nd letter, "I did not know Edmund had loved anyone. He wrote nothing of it. I thought he sailed because our father would not let him take his own life in hand. He said, 'I have been sitting 11 years beside your grief and treating it as his.' She said, 'You were kind to keep it locked. Someone had to keep it safe.' He did not answer that. He looked at her a long while. In the last week of March he began, without warning, to do small things he had not done in 3 years. He came out of the library at breakfast and took his coffee at the dining-room table with the newspaper opened before him, as his father had used to do. He went down to the stables and asked the head groom for his brown mare, which had been standing for want of him, and rode her out along the wood path in the March mud with the Kentish boy behind him on the pony he had not yet learnt he was to have. He walked into the housekeeper's room himself on the Thursday and thanked her for the shut years plainly and by her name. He did none of it with speeches. He did all of it as a man does who has slept badly for a long time and has begun to wake. Mrs. Marchmont noticed each thing and remarked on none. She wrote his post in the mornings, she read to him in the evenings, and she did not press. She had, I think, learnt long since that a man who has been held closed does not want to be lifted open. He wants to be sat beside while he does it himself. In April she took a fever herself, nothing worse than the March damp, and he sat in the corridor outside her door with his coat over his arm until the housekeeper came out and told him she was mending. In May he asked her to walk out with him. His scarred side to the county road in full daylight, the first daylight the county had seen of him in 3 years, and she took his good arm without remark, and they went down the wood path to the village and back. The vicar, who had not spoken to my Duke since the year of the fire, came out into his lane in his shirt-sleeves and lifted his hand. The Duke lifted his good hand in return. The blacksmith at the forge straightened from the anvil and looked longer at Mrs. Marchmont than at the Duke, and went back to his hammer. The two of them walked back up the wood path in the slant of a May evening with a wren singing above them, and I met them at the gate and said nothing, and neither of them said anything to me, and yet I felt I had been told a great deal. That evening in the library she read Cowper, and he asked for the Fielding after, as he always did, and I heard him laugh quietly once at a page, for the first time since his mother's Michaelmas. In June he asked her, quite plainly, whether she thought she could be happy at Havshaw not as its companion but as its mistress. She said she thought she could. She said, "I loved your brother Gideon. I loved him truly. That love is not a wall between us. It is what taught me to know a good man when I met one. If you will have me, I will be yours." They were married in the small chapel at Havshaw at the end of September, on the eve of Michaelmas, with the Kentish boy grown now to 8 and standing very straight in the front pew, and half the county, who had not seen the Duke in 3 years, come to see him take his bride. She wore a plain dove-grey silk her mother had been married in, and a bunch of Havshaw hawthorn at her throat. He wore his scar into the church and he wore it out again, and his wife walked at his side and did not touch him to steady him, because he did not need steadying. He needed only to have been found. The county came to the wedding breakfast in the great hall that had been shut for 5 years, and had been aired in the last fortnight for the first time, and the Duke stood by the west window with his wife's hand in the crook of his good arm, and greeted every family in the shire that had ever crossed his gate. He did it with an evenness that surprised no one who had watched him with her over the summer, and with a warmth that surprised almost everyone else. His aunt Lady Millicent Winter, who had not been received at Havshaw in 3 years, came up the steps at 11 and was kissed by him on both cheeks. She sat down on the bench in the porch and wept openly and was not ashamed. The Kentish boy's mother, a widow herself, kept on at the East Farm at the Duke's expense, brought a small nosegay of late roses grown against her cottage wall and gave it to the Duchess without a word, and the Duchess took it with both hands and kissed her. The calfskin box lived after that in the West Library on the same sideboard, and I never saw it locked again. The Duchess had put in it, on the day of the wedding, a small pressed rose from the wood path and a folded page. I never asked what she had written on it, and she and the Duke would sometimes, on winter evenings, take out one of the letters and read it aloud together, one of Edmund's own from the Cape or one of hers from Fenley, and they would fold it back with the pressed rose between the pages. I served them 4 more years, and they were the best of my service. The Duke came out into the county again, the magistrate's bench, the harvest supper in the long barn, the tenant's 12th night ball at which he danced once, gravely and well, with his wife, and once with the housekeeper who had kept him fed through the shut years. He rebuilt the East Farm the summer after the wedding and put the Kentish widow into a stone cottage of her own, freehold, with a small orchard, and he settled a schoolmaster on the parish at his own charge, so that the Kentish boy and every child born after him should be lettered. The county learnt to look at the scar as one learns to look at any old and honoured mark, a soldier's, a mason's, a countryman's, and then to forget it. Their first child, a dark-haired, grey-eyed boy, was christened Edmund at the same chapel the next Michaelmas, and their second, a girl with her father's steadiness in her small hands, was christened Iona the year after that. In the spring of my 78th year I asked my Duke to let me retire to the cottage at the wood's edge. He came down himself to see me settled. He stood in my small parlour with his wife at his elbow, she had the boy on her hip, and he said, "Reeve, on the 32nd letter, what made you keep it back from the refusals?" I said, "The hand, sir, something in the hand." He said, "Yes, it was the hand." He put his scarred hand out and shook mine, as he had never done in the study in 33 years of service, and he thanked me. The Duchess kissed my cheek. The boy, who had my old Duke's grey eyes and his Uncle Edmund's dark hair together, looked at me very seriously and said, "Mr. Reeve, Mamma says you are our friend." I said, "Master Edmund, I am." I set this down at the request of my mistress, the Duchess of Havshaw, in the summer of my 81st year, that the calfskin box on the West Library sideboard should have its record, and that any who read this after us should know how a wounded man was reached. Barnaby Reeve, formerly steward of Havshaw in the 81st year of his life, 1841.